Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week I'm joined by my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, to try to make sense out of the nonsense. This week we'll be talking about the Russia-Ukraine-America negotiations with some dramatic votes at the UN, the increasingly chaotic Democratic primary in New York City, where Governor Cuomo seems to be edging his feet in the pool to take on Mayor Adams. And we'll also be talking about the immolation of the Washington Post editorial page and MSNBC. And I think we might have one or two thoughts on some of the goings-on at Barnard.
So good to start a podcast with the word immolation. That's a grabber. We do like to start every show with a quote about sanity. And this one comes from the great John Cleese of Monty Python fame and A Fish Called Wanda fame, who said, "The world is insane with tiny spots of sanity here and there, not the other way around." And that feels like the perfect segue to our top story, which is about the Russia, Ukraine, U.S. sort of negotiations and what's happening there. And so, Ari, what do you think?
Well, I like that idea of a tiny speck of sanity. Hopefully, we can be that for you. You know, I was really startled by the vote at the UN. I mean, it was to see America and Israel vote with Russia and some other unsavory actors, including North Korea, was certainly jarring. On the other hand, I want to sort of give the administration its best argument, and the administration has said that its goal is to get a deal done, that it views UN votes not as kind of signals of moral virtue, but as chits on the poker table, and to be used effectively. I think everyone agrees that this war has to come to an end. So one of the difficult things about sorting through what Trump is doing is to say, is this just sort of like his way of doing it, or is there something else and something deeper going on? One thing I've been interested in is how frequently the administration, specifically Vice President Vance, has been using the word statesman-like to describe what Trump is doing. And I think what Vance is getting at is that this old idea of kind of the diplomat as a deal maker, right? And that a statesman is someone maybe who speaks to all sides. And maybe it's not always fun to see how the sausage gets made, but slap a little mustard on it and it's your lunch once it's done.
Okay. Right. So I guess that's an interesting point to start from, is this, what does it mean to be statesman-like and a diplomat? And it does strike me that the prior administration had not spoken to the Russians for the entirety of their term, which you might say was because we were actively engaged in supporting the people that they were attacking in a war. But to not speak to the Russians, for the Americans and the Russians, two nuclear powers in the world, not to speak for 4 years, not one time, struck me as dereliction of duty. And so I was happy to see the Americans speaking with them. The content of what they're talking about and whether you feel good about these negotiations or not is a different matter. But I think we have to get back to that place where our leaders are at least speaking to other world leaders. It's
a great point. I mean, I think looking back on the Biden administration, I think most people can certainly say that America was broadly speaking on the right side of the war. The question is, what was the end game, right? I mean, once Kiev was defended, once it became clear that this war was going to resemble not only a stalemate, but really a meat grinder. I mean, that we don't even know the numbers of casualties on both sides. It seemed like at that point, maybe there should have been more initiative for a deal. And that point came and went years ago. Right. Ukraine's position has only deteriorated since. Now, I think it's also possible to be queasy about some of Trump's rhetoric. We've spoken about it on this program before.
It feels like in the last week that rhetoric's changed a little bit. The dictator stuff has died down.
Right. and there's this sort of minerals deal, which is a sort of strange, is it a sideshow? Is it actually part of a broader puzzle piece here? To your point about speaking to both sides, Zelensky is going to come to the White House. So at least there's that. I mean, there was some sense that a deal was going to get done without Zelensky there at all. But there's a little bit of whiplash here, and it's sort of a brave new world. I mean, how deep will this America-Russia partnership go?
Right. Look, the critical minerals piece to me seems like, I don't know, I think it's sort of Trump-tastic, right? Like it's the way he does business. It's, no, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO, because that was a red line for the Russians from the outset, and he's not going to do that now and further escalate the situation. So how do you provide Zelensky and the Ukrainians with some security guarantees without bringing them into NATO and without actually offering them boots on the ground and security guarantees? You invest in them economically to the degree that America will have an interest in defending the Ukraine in the future. And that's sort of a Trumpian thing to do, and a way to solve some of the problems. And also, just importantly, to tell people to his right, who are just clearly by every poll measurement tired of sending money to the Ukraine, that there will be some money recaptured. It's not clear exactly how or how much or when. Critical minerals don't just pop up out of the ground. It takes years and years to assess, and then to build the mines, and then the infrastructure in Ukraine has been largely destroyed to transport what we get out of it. This is a long-term plan, but it also might make the Ukrainians feel long-term that they'll have some security guaranteed by the U.S. in that way.
And it's sort of, as America kind of comes closer to Moscow and then cuts this deal with Ukraine, it really cuts out the Europeans, right,
yes,
who are really sort of on an island. I mean, one thing I was watching for at the UN is, would France or the UK use a veto in the Security Council? Now, they never do as a point of principle, but if they were ever going to do it, this was the time, and sort of they chose not to. So, we don't want to kind of overstate the UN vote, but I do think it was a kind of intriguing snapshot of a changing geopolitical reality and a changing geopolitical world. I think, for a small country like Israel, let's say, there's really no alternative to voting with the U.S., right? Especially at the UN. Right. So especially now. So, we were sort of editorial going back and forth on it and what we thought about this, and Israel had expressed, or it's been reported, some unease about the vote. But at the end of the day, there wasn't much choice. And it just shows that, the U.S. is really charting a new course here.
Right. And what do you think the Russians are going to get out of this deal? What's in it for them other than the cessation of the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one is they lock in the gains they've already made. Now, that was likely to happen regardless. Ukraine just doesn't have, from everything we've seen, even if Biden had accelerated arms shipments even more than he did, the capacity to really win back significant territory from Russia. Now, if you're a Russia skeptic, you say, well, this is an expansionist program where you sort of secure gains now and you set the stage for further conquest in the future. I think the NATO issue obviously is a big one. The question of European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine is going to be a big one. And I think more than that, though, it's a sort of the Kremlin is looking for sort of a validation of its worldview, right? And Russia's economy is struggling mightily. And so there's a lot of, and this is the sort of art of the deal here, is that all players, I think, do have a kind of incentive to come to the table.
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to capture Kyiv, at least not this round. So, this could be the best deal that they're going to get. Right.
Okay. So we shall see. I think politically for President Trump, this is important. This is a promise that he made early on. He has to keep it. This is the most effective way for him to advance that ball.
Yeah, I will say, and this is something that I'm sure we'll be talking about as the weeks go by on this program, is, what did Trump have a mandate for, electorally? And I do think he had a mandate. I'm not saying a capital M, mandate, but a mandate. He won the election clearly on a very clear platform, and how far can he push that? Now, every president has that. But if I were him, I'd be a little concerned. I mean, I think there was a mandate for ending the war. I don't think Americans think very fondly of Putin. And I think
Yeah.
if this is seen as too much of a pro-Russia deal, I think there's a possibility of blowback. We spoke last week about, I do think there was a mandate for cutting waste, trimming the government. Was there a mandate for burning it to the ground? I don't think so. So maybe that's the kind of squishy centrist.
I guess I just don't yet see the win for Russia, other than that they didn't lose technically, which would have been a big loss. But those who were in favor of the United States funding Ukraine to continue to fight the war really wanted to see Russia decisively lose. I think that's clearly not possible, and I think it hasn't been possible for a while. And I think they're not losing is part of what will sort of please both sides, in a sense, of Americans who were for and against this war.
Yeah,
if you know what I mean.
I do. And I think oftentimes Trump's best argument is his opponent's argument. And by that, I mean, he kind of throws out or pursues these sort of strange or unconventional courses of action. And you say, okay, well, what is everyone else proposing?
Right.
And it's not compelling at all. I mean, we had this conversation around the Gaza plan. Yeah. Right. Okay. You say this is kind of goofy and sort of bizarre, but then you say, wait, well, what should be the plan for Gaza? And nobody else really has a great idea either. And Ukraine seems a little bit of a similar situation. Like, okay, you don't like this cozying up to Putin. I get that, but what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we've had several years now of this war, and several years of people who were in favor of continuing it and continuing to support Ukraine in an even more robust way. They had all this time to persuade the American people that that was the correct course of action to prevent Putin's advance across Europe. It didn't work. The persuasion didn't generally work. In fact, the polls went the other way. Mm-hmm. And so that just has to be let go of. This is democracy. Whether you think it's the right thing to do or not to stop Putin at this line or that line, the American people, I think part of the mandate was, we don't want to do this anymore.
Right. I think a lot of, as with Trump, often it's a question of tone. I think a lot of people would agree to that a deal had to get done. They say, well, why do you have to call Zelensky a dictator? Yes. And there you wander into this sort of Trumpian like subconscious or like or id, and I don't know. Is that strictly necessary? Is that his sort of way of skinning carving up the apple? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that
we're not going to change him. I think we all just have to get used to it.
Right. Zelensky most of all.
Yes.
Our next section is make it make sense, and I think we're going to focus now on New York City politics. And New York City politics is maybe provincial. A lot of our listeners don't live in New York. You might say, oh, we're so tired of hearing about these characters. But New York City stories are national stories. Yeah. And this has become a story that is federal as well as local, that involves Trump. It involves the DOJ. It involves the mayor of New York. And that's the Eric Adams, Andrew Cuomo looming feud. By the time you listen to this, Cuomo might already have jumped in to the race, and so we wanted to get ahead of that and help maybe preview it a little bit for you.
Yeah.
But Rebecca, you live in the city. You have a family in the city. What's your take about how things are in New York, and are you still invested in New York politics, or do you think it's all kind of a mess?
Well, I mean, that was a trick question, meaning.
Well, I don't know. Some people might say, they're all terrible. It doesn't matter.
I think that's what everyone says, isn't it? Always. And I can't remember the last time I was able to answer that question any other way. I'm trying to think back, maybe during the Bloomberg years. It's sort of there's like this sort of low-level acceptance that we all have that our choices are actually terrible. If Cuomo gets in, which he will likely, he is far and away the front runner. The number two is a Democratic socialist that I think he's polling at like 12% to Cuomo's 30-something. So I'm not terrified that he would win, but I'm a little worried that he's ahead of Eric Adams, who I'm not a great fan of and I think has not done a great job, and who I also at the same time think is being politically targeted even for things we may have done. So it's just a mess. It always seems to be one. Andrew Cuomo's no paragon of virtue. And he may or may not have killed a lot of senior citizens during COVID, which might have been disqualifying in another world. But in this world, I think if those are my choices, Zohran Mamdani, the democratic socialist who wants free everything and, is not a big fan of the Jews and Israel, I think I'm going to go with Andrew Cuomo and sort of try to forget that, a few people's grandmothers died because of him. What can I say?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good if dispiriting summary, Rebecca. I mean, the more I think about this Eric Adams situation, and we've been covering it at the Sun almost daily. It's probably, and I did think the dismissal of charges were a travesty of justice. I think it's just ridiculous. It's banana republic. But I think the city doesn't really need to see him on trial or in an orange jumpsuit. We haven't.
Wait, who are we even talking about? Are we talking about Adams or are we talking about Cuomo?
No, we're talking about Adams.
Unclear.
The city has enough service already. I think let him slink back to wherever he lives. Nobody knows where he lives actually, or some basement apartment somewhere.
Yes.
I think that's fine. I think in a weird way, Trump's intervention on him was sort of his electoral kiss of death. So I don't quite understand the logic there. I mean, okay, you want to keep someone in the office who can enforce your agenda. I can understand the Machiavellian genius of that. But, the primaries, it's almost March. The primaries next month. So he's on borrowed time anyway. So it seemed like the juice wasn't worth the squeeze there. I think Adams is success thus far has basically been because of how terrible everyone else has been. Yes. And, he at least projects the image of a moderate Democrat. And that's kind of how he got where he is. But, the old saying is, politicians have not 9 lives, but 99 lives. And that's certainly true of Andrew Cuomo.
Yeah. And look, again, this is a New York story where you almost don't care who becomes mayor because our city council would prevent a moderate Democrat or even in some alternate universe a Republican from doing anything that would matter or that would make the city better. So I don't know. It's just the least bad option at this point or the least scary. And I have to say the Zohran option is a bad and scary option.
Or
and
Brad Lander.
Yes. These are not people we want running anything.
No. I'm a little, I think, more positive on Cuomo than you are. Not from a sort of there's grandma, there's the other stuff.
You don't care about grandma.
I love my grandmother very much. Thankfully, she was never.
Yes, in an old age home.
She was at home. Yeah. But I think he's an effective manager. I think there will be a common sense approach. I've been heartened by his outreach to the Jewish community, very pro-Israel. Of course, it's expedient. Of course, it's self-interested, but it's better than not.
Yes.
I think the bar has been set so low that mere competence, I think, hopefully can
I agree.
Go a long way.
I kind of like also that he feels so burned by his fellow Democrats because he's going to be out for blood and he's going to be more aggressive with them than he might have been otherwise. And so we have a shot on some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between him and Hochul will be a melodrama of the first order.
Yes.
It'll make the Cuomo-de Blasio relationship look like a bromance,
Yeah.
It's interesting, the New York Post competitor endorsed Jessica Tisch, if you saw that.
Yes.
And I take a backseat to no one in my admiration for her, but I don't see any popular support there.
No, and she just started. Give her a minute.
Yeah. But it just shows that the desire for a white horse candidate.
Absolutely.
Something different. I will say, and this could look silly when Cuomo does dive in, but famously Mario Cuomo led, I think, 2 planes go on the tarmac deciding not to run for president. My dad at least still talks to I think his great electoral what if is what if Mario Cuomo would have won.
What's your what if? What if you could, Ari Hoffman could appoint someone? Who would you like to see in that role?
No answer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's how bad it is in New York. We can't
really,
even think of a name.
It's really bad.
Right.
I mean, I do think any political race is better off if it's competitive. And I think part of the problem is it's a one-party system.
Yeah.
And so I think within that one-party system, I think Cuomo is sort of as good as you're going to get.
Right.
I mean, look at what's happened in San Francisco and other cities, Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, you really,
Yeah.
it's like, you have one pizza store in town. It doesn't have to be great. You have two. All of a sudden, you have to have some new toppings.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
we need that in New York. On the governor level, we've had that occasionally. I mean, Lee Zeldin ran an okay campaign and finished pretty strongly. I will say, the returns from the presidential election show that New York politically is shifting and reddening and kind of changing. And it'll be intriguing to see who can take advantage of that and whether maybe in 4 years or 8 years or whatever, whether that pays off in a different way. Let's
hope we're still living here by then. I'd like to see it again one day. Okay, let's move on to our next segment, Tipping Point. We are going to talk about what do you call the immolation of.
Well, I think MSNBC is immolating. Washington Post is I don't know, morphing. Maybe let's start.
Do you think it's morphing? Go ahead.
Yeah, let's start with the Post. Basically just to catch people up, Jeff Bezos, who might have delivered your last Amazon package, sort of came out and said, listen, this editorial page at the Washington Post is going to be devoted to two things, to economic liberty and personal liberty. Those are going to be our North Star.
He just figured that out now after years of owning the paper.
He really thought about it.
Right.
And the editorial page editor, David Shipley, left, which I think was sort of the honorable thing to do if you don't believe in the mission, and then leave.
Can you imagine being the opinion editor of a newspaper, a major American newspaper, and not believing in that mission?
Yeah.
Like that itself deserves comment. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, continue.
And so we have a piece out this morning at the Sun, sort of. It's always dangerous to cheer for a competitor, but basically sort of, patting the Post on the back and saying, welcome to the fight. The Wall Street Journal had a similar sort of take on it. I think the first thing to say is that, an editorial page is an expression of the paper's sensibility, and it should be decided by the owner. I mean, that's not a kind of newfangled, tech bro thing to say. I mean, that was true of papers going back 250 years. And, Bezos bought the paper, and he has a right to sort of have an editorial page that reflects that sensibility. Now, whether his administration of the Post is being handled in an effective, deft way, I mean, I'm not inside the newsroom. I can't really say. I mean, from the outside, it looks sort of tumultuous, for sure.
I don't know. It just sort of struck me as so absurd on so many levels. First of all, that this is new. Second of all, that the editor would leave because of this. I mean, he didn't say we have to have this partisan or that partisan view. He just sort of said the obvious thing, which we all thought was obvious, that this should operate to the benefit of our readership and the country. Okay, so that's news for them. So good for them, I guess, for doing that. I'm not so clear that the same will be true of the newsroom. That's just the opinion page, and a lot of damage gets done, no matter what they're calling their news. There's a lot of partisanship and whatever bad journalism that goes into that. I would like to hear him say the same thing about their newsroom as he did about their opinion page. And I also just, bottom line, Jeff Bezos goes into the basket of many, Mark Zuckerberg, all of those guys who showed such cowardice and lack of principle for the last few years and seem suddenly converted when it's expedient and helpful to them, or maybe when their readership is plummeting or there's some financial interest and there's a new sheriff in town. But I hardly think anybody could imagine that Jeff Bezos didn't realize before that he should have done this and did it now just because he woke up, he had a good dream last night. And this was not authentic. Maybe it'll yield some good results on the opinion page, but I don't think the New York Sun has to worry about the Washington Post being a competitor when it comes to just trying to tell the truth and let the people decide.
No, that's a really great point. Certainly there's a feel of like the zeal of the newly converted to all of this. I thought what was kind of interesting about what Bezos said is, you can find other points of view elsewhere on the internet. So there's this very much awareness now that newspapers exist in this broader context and that not every paper needs to represent every point of view, right? So if you want a really, well-argued, socialist broadside, you'd go somewhere else. The question of, though, how much dissent should an editorial page contain is a kind of a venerable one. I mean, for example, our editorials really reflect a worldview that we think about pretty extensively, certainly the unsigned editorials. And so, that doesn't really feel like a place to include voices you don't believe in, right? Your readers come to expect a certain stance and a certain
I think that's fair, but it would have just made more sense to me if he had said over the last several years that his editorial stance was to support X, Y, the far left, fringe, Trump derangement syndrome, you name it, sort of. He never said that. He posed as a paper that reports and that has fair and balanced opinion. Right. Now all of a sudden he's identifying their opinion as free market and all that, but he never sort of declared himself before.
Right. And, I think another key point on this journey was the decision not to endorse in the presidential race, right? They had a Kamala endorsement ready to run, and he blocked it. So clearly he's implementing a plan. There's going to be bumps, as you kind of correct course. And the question is, can he steer the ship? I mean, one broader question is, is the model of a billionaire owner really feasible for media and for news outlets, especially when by and large the staff at these places have different political views than the owner does, right? And so we've seen that time and again.
Is that new, sort of historically? Maybe the billionaire with a B as opposed to a multimillionaire.
That's sort of the magnates of what would buy a paper. And
I would even maybe argue that socially the gap is closed between billionaire owners and the people come out of Harvard and Yale and go to these places. And, 50 years ago when it was some scrappy guy from Brooklyn who was the reporter and not an Ivy League guy.
Yeah. No, and right. And, the old, the great old reporters, the Jimmy Breslins and the Pete Hamels who would hang out in bars, and the kind of blue collar reporter and all of that. Well, we wish the Post well, and
but don't read them. Read the Sun.
No, of course not. The other news story, I think, and maybe here there's less nuance, is the MSNBC implosion. One thing to say is cable news is in it deep for lots of technological reasons and habits that we don't really need to get into here, cord cutting and the internet and all of that. But this implosion felt different. I mean, it really was a network that, as you said about the Post, has branded itself as a sort of resistance organ that people just weren't watching anymore. Right. The product just wasn't good. It just wasn't interesting enough.
Yeah.
And so, Joy Reid was fired, and then there was a kind of circular firing squad. Rachel Maddow weighing in. Rachel Maddow, I just have to say, Rachel, if you're listening, kudos to you. I mean, getting paid $25 million a year to host a show one day a week.
Right. And basically say the same thing over and over again, too.
It's my dream.
Yeah.
It's my dream. Rachel, when I grow up, I want to be you.
You have the same haircut, pretty much. Joy Reid, I have to admit, I didn't watch her often, but I sort of think of her and like the other Joy Behar, sort of how did these people even, right, maybe to your point about Rachel Maddow, like what are we even watching? I never watched. It not only was just bad commentary and bad reporting and all of that stuff. It was Joy Reid was an actual racist in my view. I just found her sort of offensive. I don't know how people watch that and could tolerate it. But I think the bigger problem is, not to feel sorry for Joy Reid or Joy Behar or any of them and take responsibility off their shoulders for what they say. But they were recruited and hired by people who wanted this and who encouraged it and who probably made those on-camera people feel, though they were unqualified to, move the furniture around in your house, they made them feel that they had something to say and it was important and meaningful. And the one thing I did watch of Joy Reid's was her farewell address that someone put out, and with her weeping and talking about the important work she did. And I thought, I've never seen, maybe we just define important differently, but she was not important,
no.
But somebody made her feel like she was. And I think, like our college campuses, or we recruit some crazy people and then wonder why the campuses look the way they do. If you recruit into your newsrooms people and put them on air and tell them that they matter and that their voices are really impacting the world, even as nobody's watching, I think they believe it.
No, I think that's totally right. And, I think there were a lot of empty calories and a lot of hot air in cable news. And so some correction, I think is was warranted. There was just so much nonsense.
Do you think it'll be replaced by sense as opposed to the nonsense? What do you think is coming?
I just think the need to fill so many hours of television is just, is unhealthy. Now, I don't know what you do. I don't know if you just black out hours of television or whatever, but I think, that outrage machine and sort of consistently pumping into it, is sort of short-sighted, right? Because it might give you kind of like a temporary sugar high, but in the long run, it just doesn't work.
Right. Do you think it's scaring other people straight at all? Do you see signs of that in the media?
Well, I think maybe what you'll see is sort of the contraction of salaries of that sort of prima donna mentality, right? Maybe there's a little bit of like
no hope for you now.
Cutting it down to I know.
25 million out the window.
I hear there's an open slot. Why don't we go to our Sunburn time? How we're gonna end the show this week and every week.
Yeah.
Rebecca, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, well, I'm going to violate the rules, and instead of doing a venting and a rage sunburn thing, I'm going to do like a sunshiny kind of thing because I'm in that kind of mood this week, I think. But
it has been warm in New York.
Yes. Trump's Gaza AI video. Did you see that?
I did. I have to say, I didn't watch it straight through.
Oh, I did twice. I mean, it was that good. Yeah. It was literally the definition of Trump-tastic. That's our new word on the show. It was so fun to watch. It was gold, lots of gold. It was he and Bibi Netanyahu sort of with their bellies hanging out in bathing suits on the beach in this new built-up Gaza. It was his vision, his AI-generated vision of what Gaza could be if he could just get his hands on it. We talked about getting into
Trump's head. I feel like that video was
his head.
If you sort of like had a VR virtual reality and you just dove into Trump's head. That's kind of like how he sees the world.
It was joy.
With the bearded belly dancers.
Yes, all of it. Elon Musk made a little guest appearance. Everybody was just happy and rich, and everything was gold. Like that is what he wakes up in the middle of the night dreaming about. But like on a slightly less mocking note, I just noted that it's the only, even if it's insane and never going to happen, it's the only positive vision for the Gaza Strip anybody has even tried to articulate in memory that I can remember over decades of this wrangling over this, again, fantasy of a two-state solution and this idea that Hamas could be a proper government for any people, let alone Palestinian people. There has never been anybody who's ever had this vision of all kinds of people living well in that space. And I love that he put it out there. And I'm just going to watch it every time I'm feeling bad. That's my new thing to watch. It's just great. Everyone should go and look it up.
I love that, Rebecca, right? I mean, Gaza is, some cross between like, an ISIS caliphate and a medieval torture dungeon, not least for the people who live there.
Yes.
And so, again, if you don't like Mara Gaza, fine, but what's the alternative? And I just feel like on this question, as more than any other, the old certainties have exploded and are not coming back.
Yes.
And so
there could be bearded belly dancers. It actually could be.
Bearded belly dancers and the $25 million a year.
Yes.
I'm in.
Okay, on a less happy note.
Yeah, my sunburn this week is what happened at Barnard. I have good memories of visiting friends at Columbia and going on a few dates with girls at Barnard, and to see an academic building taken over by masked barbarians, violence, a security guard assaulted, students trying to go and study or go to class being prevented. It is the definition of the inmates running the asylum. And universities really have a choice here. I can kind of get last year they were unprepared, but that excuse doesn't work anymore. They've had a year. We've seen some signs of mild spine stiffness. I mean, at least not jelly, a little bit, and at just across the street at Columbia, actually, and even Barnard when they expelled two students who interrupted the course on modern Israel. And this is the response, and it is a response that is savage and Philistine and antithetical to everything that the university stands for. I've long given hope on, faculty or administrators standing up to this, but NYPD was standing at the ready. They were ready to go, and the university refused to call them. They sent these clowns in to negotiate with the protesters. One administration official had to beg them to go to the bathroom, and they laughed at her.
Yes.
I mean, how much humiliation can these people endure?
A lot.
A lot. Endless. Right. Endless humiliation.
Right.
And I think the stakes have never been clearer. I don't know how someone sends their child to Barnard after what they saw last night. I give all the credit in the world to the heroic students, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are standing up to this, who are refusing to lay down. That's important work. But the question we'll keep exploring on this program are can universities be saved, and are they worth saving, really came into sharp focus for me last night.
And just to put a exclamation point on it, this show is called Sanity. Sometimes it's not so clear what's sane and what's insane, and sometimes it's abundantly clear. And anybody who couldn't look at that and call it insanity doesn't belong at any Ivy League institution or any institution of higher learning.
This has always been, the warning, I think, from Jews about these kinds of demonstrations is that they always, by definition, they go overboard and they go to excess, right? That the indulgence of these sort of illiberal attitudes in small ways eventually will outrun the ability of the quote unquote adults in the room to manage them.
Yes.
And it has. And it's so clearly in the DNA of this movement to harm and to destroy and to tear down. And the question is, will it be resisted? Before we go, I just want to say one more thing, and that is a happy birthday to our producer, Micah Phillips.
Micah.
We'll see you next week.